All right. Please welcome Sidney Hopson to join us for this conversation. You are a percussionist and teacher, and what is amazed to me is that you are also doing a lot of work in researching about cultural policies, and you are also writing a book, right? So let's welcome Sidney.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be a part of the conversation. Really looking forward to diving into some stuff with you.
Yeah, I want to just maybe you can make a little bit of an introduction because I remember back in the days you also advocate for artists, foreign artists, and help them, through the immigration process, etc. And I was one of them. I was a foreign student for many years, and I went through this years of trying to apply for a status and then permanent residency. Finally, I became a citizen in 2018. So it was quite a process, and I'm really amazed that you are also aware of this and want to do something to help.
If there's any phrase I think I've said the most throughout the last decade is it's all connected, right? And so to be an advocate for the arts or an advocate for arts organizations, I think you really have to take a holistic look at it. You have to look at everybody who's affected by it. You have to see the potential of what we can achieve when everyone receives the kind of legislative, social, organizational support available. And while my initial foray into arts policy was actually trying to help a friend get an artist visa, and so through that process, learning about the visa process and sort of the foreign policy aspects of the arts, essentially you can't unsee things that you learn, right? And so the same way that I learned a lot of potential that existed within the arts industries, I saw a lot of holes and a lot of disconnects between the legislature and the creatives on the ground doing the work we do. And so essentially I set out to try to find a way to close those gaps, which meant being able to both build programs, design legislation, and write to try to make the case for the much larger and holistic impacts we could accomplish if we just honed in on these sort of deficiencies in our policy mechanisms.
I know that the past couple of years you have been traveling to Washington, D.C. and meeting with lobbyists, congressmen, and so forth, and try to get through the ideas of some of your ideas about cultural policy. Now, before we go into that, I particularly want to do this with you because we just had this wonderful policy initiative from the LA County. I know they used to have the LA County Commission for the Arts, and then now it's called the Department of Arts and Culture. And they have published a county-wide cultural policy in the context, of course, Los Angeles County, which is the largest county in the United States with 10 million people and plus, with 88 cities. So I want to just I'll ask the first question is what is cultural policy? I guess you touched a little bit of that early on.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question because cultural policy is a term that's been sort of thrown around a lot in recent years, but frankly, it's still in the process of being defined, okay? So depending on who you ask, cultural policy is, policy pertaining to the arts specifically. That's, grant programs or legislation that governs organizations like agencies like the National Endowment for the Arts or even the Department of Cultural Affairs. The broader definition, which is one that I tend to identify with, is a policy that not only encompasses arts, but policies that ultimately affect both the longevity and the prosperity and the equity of cultures within the larger national context. So for example, police reform is as much of a cultural policy to me as is an arts grant. And that is very much due to the fact that both can affect the ability of the culture to thrive or hinder the ability for a culture to thrive. And to be honest, again, over the last decade, the term has, I would say, changed a bit and been used a little differently in political spheres, every year to every other year. So it is still sort of finding its sea legs. The county has done a good job in defining it and just the definition that they use and the policy that they've published. I think it could go a little further personally, but I think it's still a really positive step forward.
compared to what is being discussed in the national level, what do you think? How is Los Angeles doing?
Well, relatively, they're doing very well, and by relatively, I mean it is a very progressive stance that they've taken in the larger context of even other major metropolitan cities. The challenge is, if you look at the roots of arts policy, it was designed to be very socially passive, right? The very first arts organizations in the country, going back to 1910 in DC, of the Committee on Fine Arts, was essentially a decorating committee, right? This was the committee whose sole job was to curate paintings and murals for government buildings in the city. So arts policy at the time was merely decor. That was its extent. So as you know, the Department of Cultural Affairs, as we know it now, officially was launched in 1925, right, which is still 40 years ahead of the National Endowment for the Arts. And so that organization was essentially focused more on the community at large and ultimately curating what it felt was creative spaces for the sort of diverse populace. But that was also in light of the fact that, you know, LA was not only highly, highly segregated, you had many cultures, especially as more blacks moved from, during the Great Migration, continued on into the city.
Because we are all learning something today. I think we were like having a lesson with Sidney Hopson. You know, that's a very good opportunity for me to educate myself as well. Because as a band leader, people keep asking me how do I put this band together and everything. Of course, it's a lot of love, and then every time I'm trying to do something, and it could get very expensive, and I'm trying to fundraise, on my own with my fan base and so forth. And I remember one great example. Christo, who just passed away, always brag about his ability of fundraising, because he always say, well, we fundraise everything. All the projects, I pay for it. We raised $3 million. Everybody's getting paid. And you see the interview when Jean-Claude was still alive, it's just hilarious. Oh, wow, they have all this money. And wrapping the Reichstag in Berlin, what, LA is really advanced because this is the first one in the nation for a county to put this together. There are some ideas that I've never thought of. For example, the decentralized communities like suburbia, because to give access to not only just equity, of course, the equity being in underserved communities and marginalized communities, for example, but also geographically. They look at it geographically as well. So I felt that this is multidimensional.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge is this. Whether you're looking at the county level or the federal level, access has always been a double-edged sword of a topic, because on one hand, access is critical, especially when you look at how much of the country lives in, rural areas with, sparse to non-existent modes of public transit. The very process of getting communities who are cut off from mainstream content to be able to experience it is critical. And it's not only critical from an industrial sense, it's critical from a national sense. The idea of being able to expose more people to more types of cultural content is just critical, for us as a nation. The challenge is this. There has been disproportionately and exponentially more focus on access than equity, and what that's resulted in is a lack of equity in the content that is accessible. And so the challenge becomes, if we focus only on how to get more people to the same place and not focus on, equally on the sort of content and the policies of the organizations that we see presented, you end up often creating sort of a cultural monopoly amongst presenters. And so what often happens is, and this is obviously a conversation that's spreading a lot throughout the orchestral world right now, is that as long as it takes sort of these mass movements to push any kind of racial, social, gender equity in the industry, we can talk about accessibility all day, every day. It doesn't change the fact that we're still only elevating and ultimately serving to legitimize one primary culture through the art form. Mm-hmm. And so the question then must be asked, are we gaining culturally from this accessibility if we're still only reinforcing the same old dogmatic norms? Mm-hmm. And that's the question that unfortunately is too often not addressed by cultural policy. Because policy, whether it's been because of the sort of volatile nature, the volatile relationship that exists between the cultural sector and legislators, this feeling that if we push a little too hard or say a little too much, the budget's going to get cut, or just in the case of actual overt biases where whether it's been arts leaders or legislators or agency directors who just feel like, look, the art that matters is Western classical art. It's Western art. We'll put together a few legacy grants and cultural grants for, Black, brown, and everybody in between. But the ultimate focus of our budget, the center of our gravity, is going to be on these sort of large-scale Eurocentric institutions. And so to understand our policy, you really do have to look at it through the lens of just, legitimacy and power and how those ideas have always played out across the cultural sector.
This is probably the tough question to ask. Now, there are mentions, of course, we want to define cultural policy not only just about fine arts, the traditional forms of art and performing arts, but also, widening it so that there is more community involvement and engagement. And some people may say, well, are you taking resources away from the traditional forms of arts? What is your take?
Oh, not in the slightest. I would just say we're adding funds. Let me give you an example. So in 2014 through 2015, I spent time writing an omnibus cultural policy bill that prior to the 2016 election was making some pretty good headway. And the goal is to get it reintroduced here pretty soon. But one of the titles in that bill, in effect, took congressional funds that were earmarked under the umbrella of crime prevention, many of which were grants that were distributed via the Department of Justice to various states, and essentially took programs that were, again, labeled as crime prevention and community-based crime prevention, and made them competitively accessible to arts and cultural institutions that had demonstrated an ability over, their period of a year, 2 years plus, to have been able to make a conscious impact in crime prevention, whether that was working with at-risk kids in areas that the numbers gave pretty clear indications that if these were kids that weren't kept off the street, they were already kind of forced into the school-to-prison pipeline, and to say, look, we have the data to verify that not only were, so many of the, and so many continual programs that are funded annually through the DOJ budget and through Congress, while they're labeled crime prevention programs, are not in fact preventative programs. Some of these are grants to finance continued militarization of police, grants to continue the capital campaigns to expand prison systems. These are programs that I often call crime accommodation, not prevention, right? Exactly. And so the idea of saying, look, we're going to recognize that, the impact of these programs can range from cultural awareness to tangible crime prevention to city beautification to job growth to all these, additional sort of areas of progress, to say, look, we recognize that if we can achieve the same impact, in this case, crime prevention, then we should recognize in our crime prevention budgets and our appropriations programs that are designed to do that, that we need to make space for a more creative pool of ideas. And as we're navigating the chapter we're in right now, in the months post George Floyd's death, as police reforms have again boiled to the surface and we're in this national process of pushing for more creative, more community-based, nonviolent approaches to community development, I think now is a great time to reintroduce it. But
and
I'm biased.
and health, right? I mean, it's mental health regarding drug addiction. First of all, you have to keep people healthy and give them resources before they fall into the downward spiral.
No, absolutely. So again, in terms of how the pre-existing traditional programs would be affected, the reality is only a greater pool of funding would become available. With that said, that must also be met by continued pursuits for institutional accountability, equity, diversity. So it's not just enough to say, hey, we're going to pass this law, there's going to be a blank check of sorts for you to sort of take more money, but not actually focus on the needs of the community. It's to say that if all sides meet in the middle, and that a program is willing to demonstrate its ability to not only diversify its content, diversify its staffing, diversify its audiences, but also pay attention and honor this last sort of key element of true community partnership, which is to build these programs without the support or backing of financial institutions that are simultaneously exploiting the sort of racial biases through redlining and other sort of prejudicial financial policies. So if we meet in the middle and we achieve all of these goals, that by every measure in my book is progress. So I think the idea of getting more creative about how we achieve our ends by using pre-existing programs that we already know how they work to achieve solutions that we've already agreed we all are after just feels like common sense. So I think with a subtle broadening of the cultural policy idea and a clear communication of what it is, why it is, and what we're trying to achieve, I feel like we can hopefully have this issue behind us within a year and just get to the work of getting it all done.
You're also writing, right at the moment?
Yes. There's two big writing projects underway. One is actually a book that I had intended to release several months ago. I realized, well, with current events between COVID and now, of course, the days since George Floyd, I realized
2020.
More things. Exactly. So with that said, I set a hard deadline for myself because I realized I could just keep chasing my tail on this. But the book, my plan is to release it early fall now, so we'll get through the summer. And the second thing is a piece I am currently working on, which is essentially discussing the relationship between mainstream financial institutions, prejudicial housing policies, and arts organizations. And unfortunately, systemically now for a very long time, many of our largest institutions have depended on key sponsorship from organizations that have very intentionally and very targetedly, exploited the very diversity of their communities, while essentially turning around and financing arts organizations for the purpose of rebranding themselves. And it's nothing new.
Yeah.
But there's unfortunately become an industry trend where particularly diversity programs and initiatives are now being funded by banks more aggressively as a means of rebranding themselves in the wake of redlining settlements. So the idea being that arts organizations, unfortunately, not all, of course, but many and all across the country have become sort of these, middlemen for rebranding corrupt financial practices. And my take is that, as an artist, as an arts administrator, as an arts writer, I hold myself to the same bar here, that you can't call yourself a community partner while you're profiting from the tools of communal oppression. You can't be indifferent to the struggles of Black lives in your financial practices and then post performative statements about your solidarity with the Black community. You don't get to do both. And we need not only a narrative and a conversation, but also a policy that I think enshrines that truth and ultimately puts us on a path towards true equity, both artistically, culturally, and economically. Because at the end of the day, 2 out of 3 isn't enough. So even if we do diversify our programming and our staffing and our content, but we're doing it on the backs of the communities we claim to be supporting and empowering, it's always going to be built on a broken foundation, and it's never going to be sustainable. So the piece I'm writing now is essentially an exposition of that issue, and both shining a light on current examples as well as providing some examples of how to move forward and how to get past this and turn the page and get to a point where we can not only feel good about what we're making, but more importantly, how we're making it.
Great. Well, I wish you luck on those. I look forward to reading your work in the near future. And again, I want to thank you, Sidney Hopson, for joining us. And so stay safe and healthy. And I hope to see you very soon.
Hey, thank you, Alan. You too. Take care. Really appreciate you having me.
Sure. Thank you.
And have a great rest of your show.